request I received from Laura, and this is actually my second time to teach here. I worked several years ago with, what was it? Your
Student development.
Student development, and so I really enjoyed that. And so you filled out the Myers-Briggs diagnostic, and this is the results that came back. And so all of you should be on here. Counting Laura, there are 24 of you here. Now, this is a very important graphic because what I'm going to do this next week, in fact, I'll probably do it tomorrow, is I'm going to send to Laura a couple of pages on the leadership style of each one of you, according to the Myers-Briggs. So you should be receiving that pretty soon. In addition to that, I'm going to send you a couple of more pages about how you normally relate to your opposite. Now, for instance, I'm INFJ, and my opposite is ISTJ. And so it's going to be a couple of pages in terms of how, well, let's take Andrea, how she relates to Eric, according to the Myers-Briggs. So each of you will receive around 4 pages of material. It'll be in digital form, so you can just have it on your computer. So that's what we're going to talk about next week, because to be a leader, you've got to understand other people, and especially people who have an opposite leadership style to yours. And that's quite essential, because you can't lead people you don't understand. So, and also this is where conflict develops, is where you're relating to other people in ways that just don't fit them. Okay? So kind of get this into your mind, especially where you're located on the wheel, because we're going to be referring to this. Now, you'll notice this compatibility index. And what that means is that you as a class relate to each other at a above normal compatibility level. So you get along with each other pretty well. If it were below 0.50, that would mean you would have more conflict in this class. But 0.58 is pretty good. I think the highest I've ever seen is 0.70. So that gives you a little bit of a reference point. Okay. So what I'm going to do is take you through an introduction to the Myers-Briggs. How many of you have already studied Myers-Briggs and understand it pretty well? Okay, about 5 of you. Okay. Now you're welcome to make comments, ask questions as we go along, and we can just talk about this as we go. Now, temperament is defined this way: a person's normal, preferred manner of thinking or behaving. Now, most of you are familiar with this fellow. This is Adam Wainwright, and he's a pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he's a right-hander. Now, throwing right-handed is Adam Wainwright's normal, natural, familiar, smoother, automatic, and easier way to throw. And especially when he's under pressure of a big game. But what would happen if he turned about and tried to throw left-handed? Well, he wouldn't do very well. In fact, I could probably pitch better than Wainwright if he tried to throw left-handed. And so that's the difference in terms of temperament. Every one of you have a preferred temperament, way of relating, way of leading. And when you try to act in a way that's opposite to your temperament, it's awkward. It's anything but smooth or natural. And so that's why this is so valuable, so that you understand your natural way of relating, as well as other people's natural way of relating too. Now, for instance, looking back at this chart again, I've spent about 20 years developing expertise on my opposites. Now, one of the reasons I've done that is because our seminary administration is exactly that. It's made up of ESTJs and ISTJs. Virtually every administrator we've got is one of those two temperaments. Now, I don't know how it is here at Missouri Baptist, but I've got a feeling it's probably the same. Now, a lot of your professors are going to tend to be down here. In other words, this NT. A lot of students tend to be over here, NF. Now, in your case, the predominant temperament style is what's called SFJ. In fact, SFJ makes up 33% of this class. And that's not unusual at all. And I'm going to show you comparisons with the American population as a whole in that regard. Okay? So, now temperament does not indicate your ministry potential or your potential in any vocation. It just doesn't cover that. It says nothing about your emotions. Now, I will say this, those on the feeling side are more willing to express your emotions than those on your thinking side. But that's not to say people on the thinking side have less emotions. The thinkers simply keep them under wraps more. Those on the feeling side are willing to express them more. But same amount of emotion. It has nothing to do with psychiatric factors. It has nothing to do with your stress level. Although your understanding, your temperament can lower your stress level. But that applies to anybody, no matter what your temperament is. It can also lower the stress level between you and those people that you work for, or work with, or they work for you. It has nothing to do with intelligence. There are other diagnostics for that, but not Myers-Briggs. No temperament diagnostic has anything to do with intelligence. Now, the problem here is a lot of people think that thinkers are more intelligent than those on the feeling side. And that's not true. It's simply a myth. But in our culture, people who think rationally and logically are seen as being more intelligent, but not so. There's what's called emotional intelligence, which is also relational intelligence. And those on the feeling side tend to have a higher ability to understand relationships. So that's an important one. It has nothing to do with your maturity level, and it has nothing to do with your skill level. So what does it have to do with? Well, again, it helps you understand your specific leadership style. And we're going to get into that for each of you individually next week. It tells you how to relate to other people more effectively. And again, we're going to talk about that next week. And by the way, when you receive this, again, it'll be about 4, maybe 5 pages of material that I'm going to send to Laura, and she'll pass it on to you. Take some time to study it. First of all, to make sure that it actually describes you well. Just because you took the diagnostic doesn't mean that you took it correctly. In other words, not everybody understands themselves as well as some other people understand themselves. And if it doesn't fit you, go back to that humanmetrics.com page and take the diagnostic again until you find the descriptions that fit you. Okay? Because diagnostics are not infallible. They're not any more accurate than what you tell the diagnostic. And it'll tell you back in turn what you tell it. And so just because it gives you 4 letters doesn't necessarily mean that that's you. In fact, rule of thumb is about 20% of people who take a diagnostic with Myers-Briggs get it wrong about themselves. So a lot of it depends on the breadth of your life experience, your relational interaction experience, and so on. So it helps you contribute to the mission more fruitfully, whatever the mission is in your vocation, because you know yourself better. Now, I don't think this is going to allow me to move these around, but I'll have to show you. No, it's not. But the way I had this is me. I'm INFJ. B is for Philip, my name. So, if I'm teaching a Sunday school class, for instance, at our church, or if I'm preaching, then on Sunday morning, I act like an extrovert. Even though I'm an introvert, just barely, I act like, well, an extrovert pretty far over. Now, that's not to say I am an extrovert. It's just that I've got a lot of adrenaline going. In fact, I'm acting like an extrovert right now. And that's just normal. But on Monday morning, I swing over here. So that's what I call it the rubber band effect. Anytime you stretch yourself for being with people, leading, and what on, then normally the very next day you swing over here like a rubber band and you act like much more of an introvert than you really are. Now that's a lot of times why it makes it difficult to take these diagnostics. Depends on what aspect of your life and your vocation and as a student that you're thinking about when you answer the questions. Now, the same thing here. I'm a very strong intuitive, but my wife, Rebecca, is a very strong sensor. And so one of the things I was doing this morning, in fact, is I was talking with Rebecca, and so I've worked very hard to meet her in the middle. Because otherwise she and I will miss each other in terms of the way we communicate. Now I'm going to get more into this as we go, but sensors are very good with details. Sensors like to go from A to B to C to D, but intuitives go from A to B to G to M. We make these intuitive leaps. And so if I don't work at speaking sequentially is what it's called, and speak in terms of details, if I leave out details, which I do a lot of times with Rebecca, she looks at me cross-eyed. She said, "What are you talking about?" And I have to think, okay, I've done it again. Now, of course, she does the same thing to me, because she can get so into the details in her communication with me that I just sort of, my mind wanders off someplace, and I think, well, what's the point here? Where are we going with this conversation? So you see, understanding, especially the most significant people in your life, like a spouse, or a boss, or people that work for you, understanding whether they're on the sensing side or intuitive side and where you are in relationship is very helpful. Now here is thinking and feeling, and I'm just a notch into the feeling, so I have a lot of the thinking characteristics. And by the way, let me explain that to you. If there are 5 characteristics of thinking on Myers-Briggs and 5 characteristics of feeling on Myers-Briggs, what this means is, and so there are a total of 10, what this means is that 6 out of the 10 characteristics for me are feeling. But I have 4 out of the 10 characteristics that are thinking. Now let me say it again, because that's really important. Nobody is completely feeling or completely thinking. You're a combination of both. So again, that position right there means that I have 6 characteristics out of the 10 of feeling, but I have 4 of thinking. Now, especially when I'm in a curriculum committee meeting, like I will be, I think it's tomorrow, I act like somebody over here, even though I'm not. But I'm stretching myself, you see, to think logically and rationally about what is best for our students in terms of our course configuration. But also because I'm relating to a whole room full of thinkers who think logically, rationally. So, now, I have this wonderful daughter-in-law named Kara. Kara is over here. And so she's been our daughter-in-law for 15 years now. And so every time I'm with Kara, I stretch considerably to communicate with her over here. Why? Because I care about Kara. And I care about our son, who happens to be married to Kara. And so in fact, she's convinced. She's gotten into Myers-Briggs. She heads a school out in Labadie, Missouri. She's convinced that I'm not INFJ. She tells me all the time, she says, you are an INTJ. Well, what's she reflecting there? Simply that that's the way I relate to her. But I'm not. See, when I read the lengthier descriptions, it's obvious that I'm INFJ. Now, here's another thing. When you get those descriptions, if you're midline here, like I am, INFJ, INTJ, then let's put it this way, about 85% of the descriptions of INFJ fit me pretty well to really well. So 15% don't fit me that well. But when it comes to INTJ, about 75% of the descriptions fit me pretty well to really well. Now, that's the way that you confirm the diagnostic. Okay? And whether the 4 letters the diagnostic gave you are accurate or not, as you read the lengthier descriptions. And in fact, I encourage you to scratch out, put a line through the statements just don't fit you at all. And if you end up scratching out more than 20% of the statements because they don't fit you, then that's not your temper. So try another one. So again, especially if you're near the midline like this, that's an important factor. So again, nobody is a pure INFJ. All of the descriptions, say for INFJ, are written for a person right here, midline on the introvert, midline on the intuitive, midline on the feeling, and midline on the judgment. And hardly anybody is midline on all 4 of those. So, again, 85% of INFJ fits me. 15% doesn't. Same thing will be true for you. Now, this last one is perceiving. And again, when I'm putting together a lecture, then I get very organized. I act like somebody who's way over here. But then, sort of the next day, if I have an opportunity to let down, I come over here. So again, we're back on the rubber band effect. Kind of a description here. So all of this is to say, this is why this is challenging to answer the diagnostic questions accurately. And so it takes a while. It takes a lot of breadth of life experience and so on to be able to answer questions. Okay, so it is letting me do that. So that's conversing with our daughter-in-law. That's sermon prep. That's relaxing. Okay.
Dr. Douglas, could you explain just a little bit more about what the difference between the J and the P is? Because that word judging.
Yeah, that's not actually, judging is not a good choice by the Myers-Briggs people. Actually, that's what we're going to get into next. I'm going to go through all four of those contrasts and talk about what they mean. But the terminology can get very confusing because it's not judging. It's, I think, probably better word would be maybe organized. For J, for P would be spontaneous. Sort of responsive to immediate happenings. And so they could have come up with better. So again, these studies help you understand who you really are. And I think especially when you're in college, that's a pretty big issue. Certainly was for me. I didn't have the advantage of Myers-Briggs when I was in college. And like I say, it wasn't until I did my PhD down at SLU that I even knew anything about Myers-Briggs. So you've got a real advantage in this regard. Okay. Divine design helps prevent the projection of ourselves on others, because sort of the normal thing we do is assume other people are like we are. And that's not true. There's hardly anybody else like you. And whenever you project your leadership style on other people, these three people, for instance, then you can become very demanding and make judgments about them because they don't lead the way you lead. And other people do the same thing to you. And it can be very damaging to you. And so the more you're familiar with Myers-Briggs and who you are, and the more you're able to say to yourself, you know, this person wants me to lead in a certain way, but that's just not the way I'm wired. Now, we're going to get into the whole issue of strengths and then temptations, because Myers-Briggs can't be used as an excuse, because there is a line. On this side of the line, if you're on the judgment side in leadership, you're acting in accordance with the way that you're wired. But here's a line, and on this side, you're acting maybe irresponsible. And so this is who you are. Over here is who you are when you're succumbing to temptations of your temperament. And becoming familiar with where that line is very important. And also understand where it is for the people you're leading. So you know when they're succumbing to temptations. We'll look at that more as we go. Now here's one of my favorite cartoons from Dilbert. I don't know if you ever read, anybody ever read Dilbert? This is what's the pointy-haired boss. And he says to Dilbert, everything you do is different from the way I would do it. That's how I know everything you're doing is wrong. And so Dilbert just goes crazy over that, and he says, I wouldn't be making that face. And so that happens a lot. People make judgment about you as to how much you're like them. And that's not right. So we're different. To put it in biblical terms, we're different members of the body of Christ. Some of us are eyes, some are hands, some are feet, and all of us are needed. Okay. So let's here's some of the temptations for each of the temperaments. For ENFPs and INFPs, I don't think we had any in this class. Anxiety, fear of rejection is a great temptation. For ENFJs and INFJs, and you have a lot in this class, people pleasing and avoiding conflict are temptations. ESFJ and ISFJ, and this is the largest sector in this class, it's consumerism and selfishness. For ESFPs and ISFPs, and you don't have any in this class, it's sensuality and debt. For ISTPs and ESTPs, and you don't have any in this class, it's addictions and recklessness. For ESTJ, ISTJ, and you have a fair percentage, at least about 20% of you in this category, your temptations are being biased towards people and wanting to control people. For ENTJs and INTJs, and you have a pretty good percentage in this class, it's competitiveness and arrogance. You know, my way is the right way, kind of a thing. INTP and ENTP, and only one of you is INTP, well, ENTPs, it's ambition and fear of failure. So that gives you an idea. In fact, I find this to be one of the most helpful aspects of Myers-Briggs for me. I've gone through the literature, and the Myers-Briggs people call them weaknesses, but they really are temptations. If they're weaknesses, there's not a whole lot you can do about them. If they're temptations, there's all sorts of things you can do about them. And that gets into our spirituality, of course. And so I've got about 5 pages of descriptions of my temptations that I go over in my devotions. And it's helped me enormously over the last 10 years so that I start the morning by reading through a portion of that list. And as I'm tempted in various ways, well, again, in my case, it's over here. It's conflict avoidance and people pleasing. And so when those temptations attack me, I can recognize them. And I can hold up the shield of faith to extinguish the flaming arrows of the evil one. But also, every time that I see an INTP or an ENTP who's being ambitious and fear of failure, and they also can be very controlling, I recognize they've crossed the line and succumbing to their temptations. So I just want to say again, when it comes to the value for helping you become the leader that you have the potential to be, understanding your temptations first and foremost, and understanding the temptations of the people you work with is absolutely essential. Okay. So, now here are the STs, ST, and the general population is 30%. But here in this class is 21%. SF, in the general population is 43%. In this class it's 33%. NF, in the general population it's 17%. Here in this class is 20%. NT, in the general population is 10%. but in this class, it's 24%. So you have a high percentage of intuitive thinkers. Okay. All right. Now, I'm very quickly, we're down to, what, 15 minutes, I think. So I'm going to, is that right?
About 10, a little over 10.
Okay. I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail what each of the four contrasts mean. Extrovert versus introvert is where we're going to start. And this is from where is your energy naturally derived. Extroverts' energy directed outward primarily towards people and things outside themselves. In other words, extroverts are energized as they're relating to people or relating to projects that you're engaged in. Introverts get their energy primarily from just their inward life, their thoughts, their perceptions, their reactions, and so tend to be more internal. So introverts need more alone time. Extroverts, especially extreme extroverts, don't want a lot of alone time because that enervates you, the opposite of energizing you. A lot of times extroverts marry introverts. And so it can drive them crazy, drive each other crazy because they don't understand that that's simply an important part of who they are. Okay? So, again, extroverts' natural focus is the external world. For introverts, natural focus is their internal world. And it's pretty much 50-50. You get different estimates on that, but it's pretty much 50-50 extroverts and introverts. I'm going to move through this. Now, by the way, I'm just going to put this presentation on a thumb drive and give it to Laura, so it'll all be available to you on your intranet, or however Laura wants to get this to you. So you can look at more of these details, especially in preparation for next week, where we're going to talk about your individual leadership style. Now, I'm not going to pick on you. I'm not going to call you out or that sort of thing. I'm not going to embarrass you. So, but I do want you to be prepared for next week to understand what your particular leadership style is, and also to understand the people that you normally have the most trouble with. Okay? So I think you're going to find that to be pretty interesting, especially since I have the names of the people that you normally have more trouble with on slide 2. So here's descriptions of extroverts and introverts. The second is sensing and intuitive. And as you see, 73% of the American population are sensors. Only 27% are intuitives. And this has to do with what kind of information do you notice and remember. Sensors like practical solutions. And my Rebecca, again, is a sensor. And she's always saying, well, okay, that was a nice theory that you just told me, but what practical purpose does that have? You know, we've had that, she and I have had that conversation for 42 years. And so, but intuitives admire creative ideas and can get bored pretty easily if it's not creative, if it's not innovative. Well, sensors can't for the life of them understand why anybody's so interested in innovation all the time, or doing it creatively. Sensors don't get bored very much. Intuitives get bored all the time. So, that'll explain a lot of your academic life, maybe. Not in this class, of course. Sensors live in the here and now. Intuitives think about the future. Sensors focus on details. Intuitives focus on ideas in the big picture. So that gives you an idea of sensors and intuitives. Sensors like to do things in sequence, 1 to 2 to 3. Intuitives like to look at things in a big picture way and make these intuitive leaps. So you can look at this when you get, and by the way, sensors are inductive thinkers. Intuitives are deductive thinkers. Sherlock Holmes is a high intuitive because he's able to see the big picture and how the details fit into the big picture. So you can look at that. Here's the third, thinking and feeling. About 40% of the population are thinkers, 60% feeling. So it's how do you decide or come to conclusions. And so thinkers make decisions by stepping back from the situation and taking an objective view. In other words, want to look at things, again, logically and rationally, objectively. Whereas those on the feeling side make decisions by stepping into the situation and taking an empathetic view. And so they're always going to put people first. Thinkers are generally going to put the ideas first or the institution first. Feelers are going to say, well, okay, thinker, you're making this decision, but it's going to hurt. And then you name 10 people that the decision's going to hurt. Thinkers say, well, okay, it might hurt them, but it's better for the institution. Well, you see a lot of conflict in that kind of leadership style. So, take a look at that. And here's finally, and this is what Laura was asking about. What environment is best for you? Judgment, and again, it's not a good title, and perceivers. Judgment people, it's a planned approach to meeting a deadline in a scheduled way. So here's the deadline. So you set up a timeline, and people on the judgment side are almost always on time to class. People on the perceiving side a lot of times aren't on time to class. And when it comes to papers that I assign to my students in seminary, I can tell who the perceivers are by whether the paper's on time or not. Now, that's not to say that perceivers have to succumb to that temptation of being late, but time is not normally as important a factor to perceivers. Judgment people, their temptations get obsessive about it and get very anxious if it's not on time. So you see, here's perceiving, getting on a lot of things, and then finally at the last, they pull an all-nighter and get that paper in just in time. So that so judgment folks make decisions quickly. Perceivers like to take their time because there are always options out there, more options that could rise up. Okay, that gives you an idea of sort of an overview. And just say it again, I encourage you to look at these distinctives, and between now and next Tuesday, come to understand yourself better, and take a look at the 4 or 5 pages of material that I'm going to send to Laura, who will pass on to you, that'll talk about you more specifically in terms of your leadership style and also your challenges with people who are your opposite. Okay? Okay, I think we're just about out of time here.
Okay, thank you so much.